Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the National Press Club. As we say, the place where news happens. My name is Firdaus Al Farouk. Many of you might know me as Danny. I'm the vice chair of the National Press Club Board of Governors. I'm also a reporter. I actually have a day job. I'm a senior reporter for MedTech Insight, a medical device trade publication. I want to thank you all for being here. For some of us, this is very early, but this is wonderful to see you all here. So this whole idea started a couple months ago. Eileen and I were sitting around talking about the lack of minority representation in newsrooms and in the PR world. And having my background in the news world, I can speak to that. There's been a lot of efforts to try to increase minority representation in various newsrooms with some limited success. There's been a lot of investments from news organizations. There have been a lot of investments from various other non-governmental organizations. But at the end of the day, we don't see a lot of that translating into actual action. So the issue is, where are the problems? If we don't ask the right questions, we don't get the right answers. So what we want to do is have a forum where we can stand together and talk about what are the issues that individually we're all facing, and then take that back to our organizations, to our newsrooms, to our even to our homes, and talk about it so that we can try to come up with ideas to try to fix what is a clear problem. And so to do that, we've got this event today with some awesome speakers, and I want to thank you all for being here. So with that in mind, I want to hand over to my co-conspirator, Eileen, who's going to talk about some of the issues that are specific to the Latino community in both the PR world and the journalism world.
Thank you, Danny. Welcome, everybody. This has been a long time coming. I wanted to just go through a few of the times in history where not having press coverage really hurt not only the community, but the whole country. Let's start with the Vietnam War. The longest held prisoner of war was Mexican-American from California. I spoke with a friend of mine who was a tunnel rat. Those were people who went in, they were slight in build, and went into the tunnels to see if they would blow up first. And yet when Ken Burns did his 18-hour documentary, there were no Latinos in it. A national pure emerged, and he added it, and then PBS did its own series. In the culinary world, the James Beard Foundation, James Beard's top aide was a Peruvian chef in New York. And after James Beard died, he and I decided in 1990 to go around the country and talk about Mexican and Latino foods. Felipe died, and I tried to do it alone, and they said, do not mention Mexican or Latino foods in this building. It's never going to be on white tablecloths. 2 years ahead of, we kept lobbying, and Hiram Walker funded us to do events and to have a gala at the Plaza Hotel. The media started, and look what happened. In Hollywood in 1988, we did an event called In Recognition of Hispanics in the Film Industry. It was the centennial for Hollywood. Nothing happened. 2 weeks ago, the New York Times did a study that said 3% of Hispanics on camera and behind the camera are Hispanic in 2019. The same is true of television. The work of public relations companies and the work of the media is critical to the future of our common understanding of what is America, what is the great tapestry that makes America. And so we feel very strongly that we need to know each other, communicate, and take a major role. Thank you for being with us. And now I want to introduce our moderator. Those of you, I think everybody knows Ray, but I met Ray through the National Association of Hispanic Journalists. I wanted to show you, he's the author of a book called, and I brought the video. It's an awesome piece of documentary work, Latino Americans, the 500-year legacy that shaped a nation. The press club actually did his launch for the video being shown on PBS. I'm sorry, the documentary. And we know him as a broadcaster, a journalist, an author, and a professor. And welcome, and take it over, sir.
Thanks, Eileen. And I would be remiss, and my children would be upset if I didn't mention that all my books are still in print and go to benefit their eventual comfort in later life. Let me add my own welcome to you all. The challenge that we're talking about this morning is in many ways a surprising one. The 2020 census, which kicks off any day now, is going to count something in the neighborhood, the over-under is still coming together, but something in the neighborhood of 60 million descendants of the Spanish Empire in the New World living here in the United States. And yet, this people within a people, its distribution, its size, its spread, its desires, its potential, still remain kind of siloed information. Carried around, stored securely in the heads of people you might call the Latino whisperers, oracles, communicators, ready to connect people to markets, markets to people, people to information, and yet year after year find themselves undersubscribed, under-resourced in many organizations, people who should be some of the busiest practitioners in the vines they tend, in their industry, their sector of knowledge or intelligence or corporate communications. And the people in this room should know, people should know what's in your heads, or if you come here looking for a door to open, looking for a key to unlock, you should be able to find the people who carry this information around in their heads. To see how my panelists today look at the state of play in 2019, where they see things heading, what's coming down the road. We here at the National Press Club create a vessel, an incubator, an encounter. I mean, we wouldn't have run into each other on 14th Street, but we're here because we created this moment. And good things are bound to happen. Rosemary Ravenel is with us, the CEO of RMR Communications Consulting, former VP for Corporate Communications, U.S. Hispanic Consumer Sector, Broadcasting, Entertainment, a long career with Univision. Estuardo Rodriguez is a principal and co-founder of the Rabin Group, focuses on government affairs in the financial services and telecommunications industries. He advises nonprofit organizations as well as corporate clients. And Antonio Tijerino is the CEO of the Hispanic Heritage Foundation. He's worked in public relations for a long career, including for the Fannie Mae Foundation, Nike, and many others are among his credentials. The vision of this new thing, and at the very same time, this very old thing, growing inside the borders of the United States, is encapsulated by this odd thing that just began yesterday, Hispanic Heritage Month, which is meant to somehow bridge us from the independence days of a long list of countries in Central and South America, and of course, our giant neighbor Mexico, and Columbus Day and the dates of the first European encounters with those places that would become the Spanish-speaking nations of the Caribbean. So we get a month that is not really a month, but spans 2 months, representing a broad cultural zone that stretches north to south from inside the United States all the way down to the southern tip of the continent of South America, and from east to west, from Baja and Alta California in the west, all the way to Puerto Rico, guarding the sea lanes, heading to the Caribbean and the Panama Canal. It's a big chunk of planet Earth, and a big chunk of that chunk is here with us in the United States. So many of you in this room realize things are changing, but how? Are Americans ready for this next version of our country? Are they even aware of the size and scope of the challenges in the pipeline, the demographic revolution released by the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965, and its coming bookend in 2044, when the U.S. Census Bureau estimates for the first time in U.S. history, a majority of people living here will trace their ancestry to Africa, Asia, and Latin America, and not solely to Europe. The idea is not only to send you out the door by 10 o'clock, important part of the job of a moderator is to get off on time, send you out the door with new angles, new approaches, new facts on board, but also to get people permanently onto your radar screen as sources of information that's useful to you and make others users of information that you provide. Rosemary, why do we even have to be here this morning to have this conversation? I think the smart money would already be so onto this that we wouldn't even need to give people muffins to get them here to talk about this.
That's correct. In fact, speaking of muffins, it's interesting when you think about who picks the blueberries in our muffins, right? How those blueberries are transported to the market, when we buy them and when they're bought in bulk, how they're processed in the bakery, who prepares it in the kitchen. They're all Latinos, they're all Hispanics. So when we think about the fact that we're celebrating 4 weeks of our heritage, we were here before the first Jamestown colony. This is really not a celebration, it is fact. It is a part of the fiber of this country. And when you think about the concept, as a storyteller, that we are defined by the people with whom we keep company, the people who surround us. And if we simply get out of our echo chamber, wouldn't we be all the better? So it's a matter of just embracing what is. So we're basically celebrating 4 weeks of what is already. And I think it's good. It's better than not. But what I'm saying is that we need to open our eyes even wider because it's here already, all around us.
Eduardo, it's like the worst kept secret in America. And yet, Eileen was talking about the low numbers, the bad representation in broadcasting, which is arguably a mirror that's held up to the country, inside government, in the senior ranks of the civil service, even in the State Department, which should be dining richly and exploiting this tremendous pool of talent in the rest of the hemisphere. It's a struggle all the time, and I try not to get too bummed out about it, but why are we still having to have these conversations?
Well, one of the projects that I've been running at the Raven Group for the last 14 years is the Friends of the American Latino Museum, an effort to follow in the footsteps of the African American Museum and create on our national mall an amazing platform, and I hesitate to say a building, because ultimately it's all of these things that we can't really touch. It's a storytelling, a narrative that's been around for 500 years, yet the collaborative nature of the inception of our nation is often ignored. Intentionally or unintentionally, you decide. Most people would say it's intentional. But in that campaign, we realized that we're not pushing for an actual building. We're attempting to take over the driver's seat of the Latino narrative in the country, because that narrative is often driven by everyone except Latinos through social media, traditional media, entertainment media, and news media. It was interesting and very heart-wrenching that the El Paso shooters' manifesto was an attempt to defend a white Texas that never existed. We celebrate today XVI for our Mexicans in the room. Congratulations. But in fact, Texas was part of Mexico, and much of the US was part of Mexico. The contributions are so often ignored of the Spanish, the Mexican, and the indigenous Latino community that we find ourselves still struggling to celebrate 4 weeks, when in fact, if we were to embrace in our classrooms, college campuses, in our textbooks, the collaboration of all of the nationalities that came together and those that were already here, then perhaps we wouldn't be fighting off this white nationalist movement to defend a white Texas that never was. We would in fact be embracing that diversity beyond just, well, I'm not going to mention the Taco Bowl right now, but beyond little pockets here and there that we choose to adopt as American while intentionally ignoring the rest. So it's unfortunate that we're still fighting all these pieces when the root of it is actually as colorful as we know it to be.
And Ray, behind the scenes in your industry, we're also looking at Maria Atencio being told to not dress so Latin tonight, going to a formal gala, and to tone it down. And that maybe somebody that wasn't Latino could take her out to go shopping to buy something that was less. So it is insidious. And you have those extreme cases, but you also have this bias, and then as a Latina, a double bias. And when you talk about the census coming up, I've been around. I mean, I remember when I was working in 2000, that was supposed to be groundbreaking and ground shaking and supposed to open eyes. It didn't. People just kind of said, oh, wow, Latinos are the largest minority now. And then everything went back to usual. And when you look at advertising dollars, when you look at the amount of journalists or PR representatives or board executives, nothing's really changed that much to reflect the communities that everyone is serving. Even in the school system, I was on the National PTA board. I was one of 32 board members that was Latino, representing 1 out of 4 students. So people are going to get caught behind if they don't catch up very, very quickly. But the fact that 20 years later, after that seismic 2000 census, we're still not caught up is remarkable. And I was telling Ray before this that I was at this event in Dallas, and very smart people like Mark Lopez and our friends from Nielsen were giving all of these statistics. But one really stuck with me. If you took the entire Latino population, or actually the non-Latino population, and looked at the most popular age, it's 55. Among Latinos, it was 11. So you don't even have to wait till 2044 to address some of these issues, especially in terms of marketing dollars and advertising dollars that often make the entire industry go round, whether it's in the PR side, whether it's on the lobbying side, public affairs side, or in journalism. Let's face it, that's a lot of what runs that engine, and we're not being represented there. The fact that the narrative is now being fed, whether it's Trump's nonsense, that is dangerous, by the way. I wrote an article in Politico that Estuardo helped me place that talked about, at the beginning of his campaign, comparing the words he said about Mexicans as he launched his campaign. So when people now say, I've had enough, I'm like, on day 1 he said this. It took you 2 years to be appalled, to be outraged. And so I wrote that article and compared verbatim and juxtaposed the words that he said about Mexicans with what Dylan Roof said before he murdered those people in that church. And I said, at that time, that hate language turns into hate action. And we saw it in El Paso. But that narrative has to be driven. And if you've got such a small percentage of people telling that story, that's a problem.
But here's what catches me up short. A career newsman, I look at the world of business from the outside, but kind of an interested observer. And I'm told that market research is as sophisticated and as detailed as it's ever been in history, and computers only make it more so. I'm told that business watches the customer base more closely and in more detail than ever before in history. Then somehow I'm supposed to also take on board that Black and Latino Americans watch more network television than any other similar population, and yet are invisible on network television. That they are tremendous percentages, disproportionate percentages of the movie theater ticket buyers. Right. That they watch cable television heavily. And yet, all these places with this sophisticated market research, these tremendous databases, have so far been very comfortable with the brownout in Hollywood and on network television screens, even though, so maybe the answer is that they know they don't have to take much care to get this market because they're getting it already. And so what's the problem? Why increase representation
Well,
then?
there as someone who's worked in media for most of my career, I mean, there are contradictions. I mean, you might say, well, why is there Spanish language television, for example? Univision is the leader in Hispanic media. And you say, well, because they created, along with the Procter & Gamble's and the large consumer marketers, created the market to a large extent based on certain commonalities, language being the dominant one, right? So that there are these parallel universes where you say, yes, we do watch English language television, consume mainstream products and services, but at the same time, there's a desire to sort of keep us in that pocket, which is bound by cultural cues, language dominance and such, so that which perpetuates a sense of separateness. So there's as many similarities as there are differences, even among our own communities, right? But so it's not homogeneous, it's not monolithic, it's not linear. There are as many zigzags along the path as there are Hispanics in this country, right? So it's to some extent the media and consumer marketing has perpetuated the sense of, and Nielsen and Pew and so many other major research companies are justifying the fact that we do consume more of certain products. We are more inclined to certain behaviors as consumers. But somehow, you're right, it doesn't quite click as to why we need to have higher percentages in representation in terms of what the general market sees as portrayals of us. And another thing is, we all know we don't look alike. We don't act alike. Many of us don't even speak Spanish. Many of us don't even have Hispanic surnames. For example, my name, Rabinal, is from Spain. But many people look at me as if they don't know what my origin, because it's not Sanchez, Martinez, Perez. So that there are as many differences among our own communities as there are similarities.
I would say, though, that glass half full, right? Yes, to a certain extent, they can continue to do the cookie cutter entertainment and do fine. But you do see when those companies actually double down and really dive deep into the Latino community, culturally, ethnic nuances, they turn out some big winners. Coco is a huge example that had a universal appeal. The diversity in the Fast and Furious series, everyone knows about. Jane the Virgin, and there are several other examples out there where when the companies actually do invest in the nuances there of cultural aspects of the Latino community, it actually transcends the Latino community, and other groups end up tapping into it and finding themselves in that. It does come down to a combination, I believe, of more diversity behind the camera, additional pressure from outside organizations to keep telling them this is the right way to do it, and it's a business. They have to see the business success in it as well. And I think there are case studies where there's tremendous financial success and outcomes from those investments, which hopefully spurs additional production. But that's just glass half full. I don't know.
Yeah, but Coco, the success of it was because you had Latinos behind it within this huge company. You had
Also Disney with its huge reserves, obviously, and their marketing machine.
Yeah, but also they got it right because they had Adrian creating that movie. They had Julianne Cromit behind the scenes pushing for it. You have Black Panther, the success of Black Panther, which is huge. Well, it's because Victoria Alonso was behind the scenes pushing for it, and she has a diverse lens. So you have to have people in position, these decision-making positions. We work with corporate America, all of us do, and I can tell you some of the great ideas by somebody that is not from our community was cringeworthy. I mean, it would be like, oh no, we're doing this great, program for youth here in the United States, and I have a great idea. We're going to do it in Spanish. It's like, well, that's for the parents. I mean, if you're a kid, for the most part, and those are the panacea to everything is to do it in Spanish. As you said, there's a lot of young people, especially in certain parts of this country, that are 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th generation that don't speak a word of Spanish and consider themselves more Texan, for instance, than they do of Mexican origin. And then there's different communities that you have to understand that a Salvadoran from Washington, D.C. is very different than a Salvadoran from L.A. a Cuban from New Jersey is very different than a Cuban from Miami. And so on. Somebody here is Peruvian. I was born in Nicaragua. And then you have
Cuba.
Cuba, and so you have recent arrivals, and the different. There's a completely different strategy for all of these different groups. The right people have to make those calls, and that's why I really admire the work of Eileen, and I remember, and Ray, who's always represented us, and you, and we also had people like Daisy Exposito that was out there swinging
Very
hard,
early on.
tirando golpes in the 80s and in the 70s. Leonel Sosa was out there throwing blows on behalf of our community and helping make those decisions in terms of how to more reach our community more effectively, but also tell our stories in the right way.
The business case is clear. All three of you, in your ways, have made the business case. And yet, when business releases its clenched fingers and a couple of dollars fall out, it's done with condescension, paternalism, this idea that we're doing you a favor here, pat you on the head, throw a couple of dollars toward your project, not as a robust gesture of commitment that says, no, we recognize the trillions of dollars you spend. We recognize the numbers that you represent. We recognize that if we're not talking to this market, we're taking a risk for our future. There seems to be very little sense of that. Carve out this marginal space, say, hey, see what we're doing for you guys? We love you guys. And yet at the same time, these numbers, these tremendous, robust numbers, seem not to make the case on their own.
Well, you mentioned some of the early pioneers of Hispanic advertising and marketing. I was part of that early stage, and I remember the business cases that were created and the terminology, the Latino boom, right? The burgeoning Hispanic market, the vibrant community, and all of these terms are still being used. It's the same rhetoric, the same metaphors that we keep using, and it's the same. The market has grown exponentially, right? But there's still, in terms of who has the key to the coffers, right? Who makes those budget decisions? In many cases, they're not Latinos, or they're not as aware. The people who make the decisions are not necessarily dispersing based on market opportunity or justice. So I think that there's still a great deal of work to be done in terms of who makes those decisions, the leadership of companies. Are they enlightened enough to see the opportunity and to be fair and to distribute the resources accordingly? So I think that there's still that is, I think, a barrier to having the kind of fluid investment in marketing that's required.
But does it have to be self-conscious? Why isn't it organic? Why don't the force of numbers and the lure of dollars just do the work on its own? Hidden hand, animal spirits, the whole, all the catchphrases of capitalism that we've been marinated in for our whole lives. Why isn't that doing it on its own?
I'm going to jump in here real quick.
Yeah, please.
Why don't we have a museum on the mall?
Right.
Just talking about my friend here who's leading that effort. Why do we get taken for granted as we're heading into an election cycle? Once again, despite the numbers that we keep talking about in terms of Latino, the power of the Latino vote that we have seen over and over again for the last few months, we're taken for granted, which means we have to be louder. We have to demand things as a community. And this is traditionally what's happened to us, that we've often been taken for granted as that power.
Absolutely. I think we ebb and flow as well. I mean, there are moments where we celebrate. There's a Latino CEO of this company or Latina CEO, and we can go back in time and look at Mr. Goizueta, who turned Coca-Cola from a national company to an international iconic brand. Not a lot of people know that, right? But it is about constant pressure. This Congress, now the House led by Democrats for the first time, has created under Maxine Waters a diversity and inclusion subcommittee under financial services for the mere purpose of holding companies accountable to what is your diversity initiative. So it comes from all sides. It has to. Because once you get a victory, whether it's in the 80s with Coca-Cola or with United Airlines today, and so many others, you can't go back and rest on your laurels. It is going to always have a moment where everyone finally sees this is great, and then the shiny object over there comes up, and it's a different consumer market, and there's a different strategy, and here's another boom, and they move on and say, well, we took care of Latinos, or we took care of African Americans, let's focus over here. The best part for me of the trend now with live streaming is that you see a mad dash to win over there. And Netflix, as an example, has invested so much in diversity and original Spanish language programming that it's kicking the other guys' asses, right? And so now Disney's live streaming, Apple's live streaming, everyone's live streaming. So it does put pressure on some of the big networks as well to say, well, how are they doing it? Whether or not they'll ultimately succeed is another question. But that combination of pressure is that next, I guess, pressure point for the entertainment industry to realize why diversity matters. That does not mean that we're off the hook. It doesn't mean that all of a sudden we go back and focus on something else. Ours, as Tony does a great job with the Hispanic Heritage Foundation and the Hispanic Heritage Awards, is constantly reminding the industry, you're not doing enough. And that's going to be a lifelong job. You're not going to retire, man. I'm sorry, but that's just how it is.
And our own community has a problem with diversity. Our own community has a huge problem with representation of Afro-Latino, GLBTQ, disabled community, Jewish Latino community, Muslim Latino community. I've always said that we need to define ourselves, but that definition needs to be broader and broader. And I just wrote an article actually for an insert of the LA Times where it was that if we're so against building walls, why do we build them between each other? You also have issues with diversity because somebody is too fair-skinned or has green eyes.
I don't think that's ever been a problem.
That is a, hey, Ray, that is
There are women working with 6 different shades of blonde hair on Spanish television, all the way from platinum to...
You're making a joke, but there's a whole lot of people that are being ostracized from the Latino community because they have the wrong last names in their minds, or they have green eyes that aren't, contacts. And the wrong hair color, or someone like me that speaks bad Spanish, pero a mí no me da pena. I get interviewed on some of these Spanish language stations, and they hear me start talking, and they're like, "Oh, está bien, señor. We can edit this down." And I'm like,
You're
"No,
not
no."
really Hispanic.
We'll use subtitles for you, Tony. Don't worry.
Yeah, and I'm like, no, a mí no me molesta. A mí no me da pena. Yo tengo mucho orgullo en hablar español, hasta que hablo mal, pero me da mucho orgullo. And so I end up talking. But there's a whole lot of people that have been shamed to the point where they don't even self-identify. And that's something that we as a community, as much as we're complaining about diversity, we need to look at diversity, gender diversity within our community. Constantly have to pay attention to that.
On the language issue, I would just throw in a personal anecdote. My daughter told me this weekend that her Spanish teacher, who's from Latin America, asked her why she didn't speak Spanish. And she explained, well, my dad's very fluent. My mom's from San Antonio. She explained the scenario and that I basically hadn't emphasized it at home. He proceeded another 30 seconds to say it's not your fault, it's your father's fault. It's shaming her, basically saying that your father just did a terrible thing. I mean, that division within our community, by the way, I have a parent-teacher meeting that's going to come up soon on that, but, which we'll do in Spanish.
Yeah.
But it is, Tony makes a great point. We can put pressure on the outside media and the outside corporate forces and everyone else to diversify, and yet we have to clean our own house as well. We have to make sure that we're not continuously dividing ourselves. The biggest challenge that I have as running this Friends of the American Latino Museum campaign is remembering and reminding my staff, my team, to look for those stories of the Tainos on the island of Puerto Rico, the Asian Latinos, right? That diversity has to exist as well.
Yeah, I mean, the language, I mean, this is sort of bubbling into so many interesting areas. But I want to make a point about language. You know, when I work with CEOs who are not fluent in Spanish, for example, but need to deliver a speech in Spanish, I urge them, don't worry about it. Use the language. Use your native language. Speak it as the best you can. And just not be embarrassed. Keep working at it. Certainly try to improve every time. But take your pride and put it to work, right? And that speaks volumes, right? And similarly, someone a long time ago, Gustavo Godoy, whose name you may know, a long time ago said to me, exercise your Hispanic identity at every moment in your life. For example, when you go to the ATM to take out money, instead of choosing the English language option, choose the Spanish language option. Why? Because that tells Bank of America that they have a Hispanic consumer, which means that then that might replicate in terms of them investing more money, et cetera, et cetera. So we can do very small things. We can buy maybe the Conchita brand of garbanzos, of chickpeas, as opposed to the Del Monte, et cetera, et cetera. You get the point. So we can do that consciously in everything we do every day.
And it comes down to even saying your name.
Yes.
When people ask you what your name is, you say Antonio Tijerino. And I tell my kids, say it the right way. They can say it the wrong way, but you say it the right way. Because there's a lot of times when you anglicize your own name. The other thing is calling people out on the news media that are still using the word illegal constantly. I even had someone come up to me and say, oh, I appreciate all the work you're doing on the border with all these illegals. And it was heartfelt, but they're hearing it from somewhere.
Right.
Somehow saying that it's okay to use that kind of language. That's offensive.
Offensive, but how important. On the long list of battles to be fought, how do you decide where that ranks or what you ought to be worrying about instead? Or is there anything else you ought to be worrying about instead?
I fight every single battle, every step of the way. And it's exhausting. And my wife is in my ear telling me it's just not worth it when we're at my son's flag football game and you start arguing with somebody. It isn't worth it, but it is worth it. It's not worth it from a standpoint of you're exhausting yourself. You're exhausting everyone around you. I have a hashtag that says stay outraged with everything that's going on every single day. There's 4 and 5 things happening every single day that go past us. I was giving a speech at a company actually in Minneapolis for Hispanic Heritage Month last year, and somebody told me, what's it like to be in Washington dealing with this onslaught every single day from what's happening from not just the Trump administration, but across the board. And I said, it's like all of you throwing a tennis ball at me, and I'm trying to catch as many as I can. I'm going to catch 5 or 6 on a good day, and the rest are going to fall on the ground, but they're just as important. Money's being taken away from relief missions in Puerto Rico to fund border security at this time of hurricanes. That's going to slip by. Somebody actually, they just tried to take away birthright citizenship at one point. We're talking about it, except they told them not to do it. But they thought about it. That's a fight worth fighting. At a mall, when you have somebody that's following you around because you're brown, it's a fight worth fighting. When I was running, I was doing some work in El Paso, actually, the day before the shooter. I was at that Walmart buying toys for the kids. We were about to go to Juarez, or we were just in Juarez, and we were trying to get some stuff for the kids. And I was running along the border, and I got stopped by Border Patrol.
Say, it's that you were running.
Yeah, but it's true.
Had you been walking, you might not have been stopped.
Oh my.
But these are things that we have to take into account, and we have to battle every step of the way, because you're in a position of privilege that you have a voice or that you can do something about it. Every meeting that we have, every time you're on the air, every time you're in a corporate boardroom, we represent everybody that isn't in that meeting or in that room across the board. And that's a big responsibility to have, because not every group has that responsibility, but we have it. We represent, I tell people all the time, we all represent every single person that they've ever met that was Latino, that they hear about that's Latino, that they've seen in a movie, that they've seen in news coverage. We represent everyone, and we have to continue to represent that value proposition we bring this country.
It's exhausting, but yes, you're right. Having to represent everybody all the time is kind of nuts, but there it is. It's that funny duality of this kind of 21st century life where, you know, I'm asked about all kinds of things. For instance, you know, whether my family's here illegally. And they said, you know, one person arguing with me over a point of politics said, you ought to be grateful that we allowed your family into this country. And he felt not even a moment's discomfort at representing the national we. He was just some guy, and he had welcomed my family into this country. And I said, well, you know, if you consider invasion, occupation, and annexation being welcomed into the country, I said, then I guess we were welcomed into the country.
He was arguing with the wrong guy.
Yeah.
I read your book.
All right, but
Which brings up the point of history. You know, history is why a museum, I visited the African American Museum yesterday and was absolutely awed, and saw how our history is intertwined with African American history as well. But
in ways that don't bring tremendous pride and credit,
Absolutely.
but okay.
in any case, the historical aspects of that, what we're living today, you know, with all of this immigrant backlash, is nothing new. Because you were looking about just within the 20th century, the repatriation of Mexicans, predominantly Mexicans in the 1930s, because we as a community were being outcast because we were taking jobs away from people who were in the food lines, you know, during the Great Depression, and just summarily put on buses and taken across the border and just dumped anywhere. And there was no outcry. There was just no, but it happened. It happened in the hundreds of thousands. And then Mexicans were welcomed in during the Bracero program because they needed jobs, because then things were booming again, right? And then people were going off to war. Somebody needed to do the work back home. But then they didn't need us anymore. And then they said, oh, Operation Wetback, go back. In 1955 and in the late 50s. So what I'm saying is nothing that we're seeing now is new. All these cues came from before. And if we know that, it sort of gives us a point of reference and gives us the strength to say, you know what, we were here 500 years ago. You know, we've been through this before. This is nothing new. We can educate people who are not as informed and tell them where to go to get information. Because I think if they start to see it from that perspective, then they start to open their minds to a different way of thinking.
Yeah, I think the job ahead of us is to be passed on from generation to generation because of how great the task is. The Mendez family in California, for example, Tony had an opportunity to meet Sylvia Mendez many years ago, introduced her to me. Her family is tied to the Mendez versus Westminster case. I don't know how many of you know the Mendez versus Westminster case, but that's the precedent to a Brown v. Board of Education. Everyone knows Brown v. Board of Education, but you know, Mendez versus Westminster was the central case that identified a specific community in this situation, Mexican American students, who had the right to go to a public school. And that story, the family was trying to make sure that that story was in the curriculum in California, just in California, where I went to law school, so I saw the footnote reference to Mendez versus Westminster, and I had no idea what it was about until it was explained. But that's something that should be taught across the board, across the entire country, so that people understand how far back we go and how deeply rooted we are, not just in the agriculture aspect of our nation, but in the areas of our civil rights, in the areas of our economy. You know, the women, Latinas, are the fastest growing small business owner in the country, which also adds up to them and Latinos being the fastest job creators in the country. So that economic boom is there. Again, it's a full circle of, well, if they see the money, then why doesn't it happen organically? It doesn't, and it's not going to happen organically, right?
So if you are on the inside, if you're a corporate communicator, if you're in business, how do you bring this to the conversation without being the staff crank, the consistent greasy wheel, the pain in the ass? This will be beeped out later. Inside your organization, and somebody who is recognized for being strategic, forward-looking, and where things are going to be 2, 3, and 5 years from now? Will you get credit for that? How do you handle yourself on the inside so that you are not, that person, that guy or gal?
I've been on the inside, so the best way is to position yourselves as a tool to make things better, to make more money, to get more clients, to get more coverage, and as long as you have enough ammo out there, salvo out there, that you can pull together, make a really good case as to why this helps whatever they're trying to attain, and that your boss or the company is going to look really smart for doing it. I mean, the person who pitched crazy rich Asians looks like a genius now, and there'll be copycats all over the place because they made a case. And actually, there's an interesting case on that there's an Asian group of wealthy Asians that actually pooled together money to ensure that the box office was going to be positive as soon as that movie came out, and guaranteed it. So now they're going to get more movies made. That is a powerful community coming together, and that's part of it. You have to make the business case or whatever case that they're trying to make. So if you're going to write a story and get a Pulitzer, that's going to be positive for the company, and that's how I've always handled it. And that's why it's so important to have people like Mark Lopez and the Nielsen folks and other folks that are able to give you that salvo that you can use to make that case as to why reaching our community makes business sense, and as well as the case for a responsibility to serve the community.
Is government, because of the way our politics are so fraught at the moment, is government calibrating differently on some of these questions from commerce? Is commerce already kind of comfortable with some of these things, while, for instance, in Arizona, you have a state legislature making illegal the teaching of Mexican-American history in the high schools, at the same time as you may have Coca-Cola handing out hundreds of thousands of posters to be put up in public schools during this particular month of the year, highlighting the contributions of the history of Latinos in the United States.
That's when you cry outrage. That's when you start to do what we know how to do as a community, which is to boycott, which is to picket, to protest, to get the right people elected, to change the people in power, because that's when you really get to the point of taking the clock back, into the dark ages. But I think it starts, when you ask what can we do as individuals, it has to do with, small things, certainly the language that we use, and to your point about illegal. I think the press corps, I know that there are some news organizations that have become enlightened and have their own style books and have their own vocabulary. Undocumented is a preferred word. There are some other synonyms, but certainly anything that says alien or illegal should be banned, okay, unless somebody's coming from outer space. So it starts in the way we express ourselves, the way we talk about each other. And secondly, our own sense of identity and pride, what we teach our children. Language, regardless of whether it's, it's Mandarin or it's Spanish, it helps us all process information better as individuals, as human beings. Multi-language communities thrive. So it's just a matter of fact. So let's teach our children another language. And let's be vocal. We have to be vocal, and we have to be active citizens and speak out when we see something that's unjust.
Are there questions that I should be asking? Here they are. Okay. Practical tips. Our major think tanks, Brookings, Aspen, Center for American Progress, continue to publish without Latinos on research, without Latinos on panels, secondary subjects. What can Latinos do to be more involved in places like that and ask more questions of these powerful think tanks?
I just want to make sure, Aspen, for instance, again, it's who's representing us at these different institutions, whether it's a company, a news organization. Abigail Golden Vasquez is there, leading Latinos in Society. Monica Lozano is chairing of that board. And I know like 4 other people that just got there. Maribel Duran just started over there, is working over there. So I think part of that is that representation, and also counting on allies like Nicole Turner-Lee that's over at Brookings that I know is looking out. So I think it starts and ends with how we're being represented, and sometimes it's not enough, but that puts an even heavier burden on the few that are in those positions, and hopefully they're like Abigail, that understand that they represent our entire community.
I would also add to that we have a challenge in that we need to have our own pipeline of candidates as well, individually, because we often do talk about some of the folks you mentioned, and yet when an opening does come up, we're scrambling, like, well, who do you recommend? And then sometimes we end up recommending the same person over and over again because it's easy. But it is on us to not only put pressure, but say, here are 5 great candidates I know. Would be great for that job or that job, right? We can't expect that the all-white C-suite of a company, after finally convincing them they need to diversify their corporate board, for example, that they're going to have a bunch of Latinas or Latinos, to pick from. They only know a certain process to identify candidates, and it's likely from the same pool that they always go to. So it's on us to really be able to have the great talent.
Yeah, and there's groups that are trying to advocate for changes in corporate governance. For example, Latino Corporate Directors Association. But it starts small. It starts small. I mean, I'm thinking about elected officials. It starts with the Board of Education of a community. You can have active civic engagement at many different levels, but you just have to be active because those voices, particularly now with social media, do amplify. So I guess it can start very small.
As was mentioned earlier, Latino entrepreneurs are a rising force in the U.S., but still face significant barriers in getting their businesses funded, especially from banks. What can we do to change this trend? What can we do as a group to persuade the business press to accurately describe our significant business success?
I would throw out there something that under the Obama administration, I became a little more familiar with this Small Business Administration. Some of the programs under the SBA continue today, but my father came from Peru in the 60s and was a self-made business guy. He just bullheaded, and the more professional business consultants got to know my dad's business. They wondered how the hell he was still in business and not bankrupt, because he just took risk, and he didn't take out loans, and he just did it on his own. I think the Latino and Latina entrepreneur out there is very much like that. They're like, we're going to set up a business, and there's a stand, there's a door, it's open, and let's go. And what's missed, as successful, and I will always applaud what my father was able to accomplish, but I wonder how much more successful would he have been had he understood the SBA programs that are out there to help small businesses, right? How much more successful would he have been if he would have known what incentives or programs, even locally, there were for small businesses and incorporating as a Latino-owned business, et cetera. To a certain extent, as much as culturally we are hesitant to work with the government on some of these programs, there's a considerable amount of money left on the table because we don't go that extra mile to see what programs there are for us. And then we find somebody else who took advantage of the program and we're throwing rocks at them like, he's taking money from the government. But it's a real boost. And so, it is a hassle and there's tons of paperwork, but there's a whole area that we leave behind.
What opportunities exist outside the Latino community for coalition building? What issues are most ripe for civic engagement?
I think it's an example of the Mendez versus Westminster is a perfect example of the different communities working together. You had the reason they had the land that put them in a place where they wanted to go to the segregated school was because a Japanese family gave them that land. The person that was working on that case for the NAACP was a lawyer named Thurgood Marshall. The justice that became a Supreme Court justice was in California, was Warren, Justice Warren. And then you had the Latino family. So those are 4 different communities that came together to do the right thing. So I can't tell you how important it is that we count on allies and be more inclusive as a community, because we really, it's going to take a concerted effort to be able to get anything done.
I think we have to overcome our own biases as communities. We discriminate among ourselves and other communities of color, and so it's the common ground. Where is there the maximum gain? Collectively, and that's really where we start. And it may become the way the climate change issue is unfolding, that becomes our galvanizer, because we all share this planet. So there may be things that are beyond what the major topics of discussion of the day are. Maybe things that bring us together in ways that we have not even anticipated.
In my experience as a journalist and communicator, Latinx usually get typecasted to only cover those issues, Latinx issues. How do we break the mold? And associated, another question. We all acknowledge the importance of the Latino community and our issues, but how do we communicate that to mainstream media assignment desks and producers? Besides immigration and natural disasters, we are absent from the coverage and the discussion. And
I think we saw that during the debates. Jorge Ramos and I apologize, the African-American woman who was also there. No, the reporter, the interviewer. I apologize, I forgot her name, but
From Univision?
No, from the panel,
panel.
from the dais. The two reporters who were asking the candidates questions, those from communities of color got specific questions that were about either the Latino community and immigration reform, Jorge Ramos, and the African-American woman got the questions around gun violence and criminal justice reform and how it impacts young
But the
African-American
tough thing
men.
about that is, and believe me, I've been in that position.
Yeah.
You feel like if you don't ask that question, if Jorge Ramos asked about
Sure.
Syria
Yeah.
or whether ISIS was wiped out, there was a reasonable
who's-
chance that nobody would ask about immigration
absolutely,
reform.
absolutely,
So you
but-
think, I got to do it because I'm sort of stuck here. I mean,
No, I hear you on that. But it's unfortunate because it shouldn't be that way, right? It should be
Granted.
before we all get on here. Hey guys, and ladies, how about we shake it up a bit and you ask the immigration question, Anderson Cooper, and I'll ask the question
Healthcare,
about
healthcare, which is
healthcare,
interesting,
right? Because at the end of the day, Ray, you're as in depth on many of these issues and as any other non-Latino journalist, and should be able to add your personal perspective or your view on those issues. So yes, I agree. If we don't, then maybe nobody does. But perhaps that's a challenge. I do think that's why National Hispanic Journalists Association exists, the Black Journalists exist. So many of these diversity trade associations exist because of that constant responsibility to put pressure on industry and hold their feet to the fire. And that's going to be something that's passed on generation to generation because we're not going to fix it overnight.
My good friend Giselle Fernandez is always going to represent the Latino community because her name is Giselle Fernandez. But when she was doing her thing, she was covering a broad scope of information. Bring it up to currently, my good friend, Cuban-American Jesse Rodriguez, who works over at MSNBC and is right now the chief booker for all of those programs. His name is Jesse Rodriguez. I've known him since he was 17 years old. He has that lens, but he needs to make sure that he has the appropriate experts to address the appropriate subjects. So they can't compromise that, but they certainly will always reflect who they are and what their culture is, and have that additional level of sensitivity. You, Ray, when you were on, I felt comforted knowing when you were working on PBS NewsHour, knowing that what you represented beyond whatever subject matter there was. And there is that comfort level. I think that it's critically important, too, that we look at the double duty that a lot of these people are doing. For instance, Alejandra Castillo, who was at the Minority Business Development Agency, was the first Latinx person to run that agency in history. I know that she's a Dominican American, extremely proud of where she comes from, but she was representing the overall business community. But I felt comforted knowing that now she's running the YWCA. Those are 2.2 million girls and women. I think it's our most powerful leader in of our community, but she's running a mainstream. Sylvia Acevedo is running the Girl Scouts of America. You know, they're running national organizations that they have to do triple duty because they're women as well.
Recently, Forbes had its 100 Most Innovative Leaders issue. Had only one woman, 3 Latinos, no Black or African American leaders. These are clearly issues, there are clearly issues with the metrics used, but also what can be done to strengthen the pipeline of leaders in business and communications, public affairs, to elevate those leaders, so Forbes doesn't put out another list like that for them.
Well, I think to some extent, us as communicators, as public relations people, we have to promote ourselves.
Yeah.
People will not hear about us if we don't speak up.
That's right.
So I think we have to be, you know, sometimes at the sake of humility, we have to be very vocal and promote each other and applaud each other and comment and get the circulation of our names and our accomplishments out, because that's a totally erroneous list. Why? Because the people who submitted the names for consideration had
That's
certain
exactly
interests.
right.
So it's a matter of what is your pool. If your pool is X, then it's not going to include the others. So it's as simple as that. You have to and we have to be our own publicists as well as publicists for our communities and our cohorts.
The decision makers in the Forbes suite clearly did not have any diversity, because it's the job of, we do a lot of consulting, and part of our jobs is to say to the client, you can't run with that list. You just can't. And no one in Forbes C-suite or in the editorial department was there to say, we can't do that. This is crazy. Who, you know, just do, you have to, maybe there was like, oh, you got 3 Latinos, yeah, you're good. Still, on the gender side, it was horrific. And so I think Forbes probably thought, oh, this is an innocuous, 100 leaders, we do it every year. But it got greater publicity on the fact that they were so tone deaf in 2019.
We have to write. We have to write letters. We have to post in our social. We have to be active.
Yeah,
Say
they've been shamed on it. Obviously, they should be shamed for the rest of the year.
Maybe we'll take it into consideration for the following year. And just we stop subscribing. There's many ways we can have a counter movement to that.
And it's not. And as you said, it's not innocuous. It actually feeds a narrative.
Exactly.
You see.
Exactly.
Yep.
This is what we've known all along, and now we see it in writing. I've never heard that. That list is just absolutely reprehensible that they put something like that out, or that they even thought that it was legitimate.
Right.
Good Lord.
Other than Julian Castro and Beto O'Rourke, are any of the candidates for the Democratic nomination for president sufficiently or uniquely committed to Latino concerns?
That's a good question. I thought it was. I'm not really going to answer.
Depends
very
where
well.
they're campaigning.
I'm
first
not
of all.
gonna. Yeah, I'm not going to answer
Yeah.
very well. But I do think it's very interesting that to launch their campaigns, at least 3, and Ray, you might correct me on this, but at least 3 candidates went to Puerto Rico just to kick off their campaign, which I had never heard of. Like in my years in politics, the fact that they went to the island, well, clearly it was post Hurricane Maria, but it wasn't like post Hurricane Maria a week later. It was a year
Right,
later.
a long time after.
Yeah, it was a long time after that. But the neglect on the island through this, because of this administration's focus on on things they felt were more important, they felt compelled to go there. But that spoke volumes to not just the Puerto Rican community on the mainland, the displaced families, the diaspora across Central Florida. Now, given there's a huge effort to turn Florida blue, and they know that the growing political base
migration.
In Central Florida is significant for 2020. All that strategy aside, right? The fact that they went to Puerto Rico, I think means that there is a recognition that all of the diversity of the Latino community must be paid attention to. not just what's happening in Texas, but the connection and the appreciation for the Puerto Rican diaspora. And that's something that I think will continue to grow as we slowly whittle down to the candidates.
It's not cynical, just an observation, that if they thought that this was not a weakness for President Trump, they wouldn't have gone there, or they wouldn't have had to go there until later in the cycle. The fact that they went there early and made sure they had their pictures taken there and so on, they may see that the road to Florida runs through the island.
Well, but the optics are important, and besides, there's a great deal of Puerto Ricans so disenchanted with the way they've been treated that they're coming and establish residency in the mainland so they can vote in the next presidential election, because currently they can't vote if they live on the island.
Well, they know the 2016 and 18 elections in Central Florida, while they didn't turn out, 2016 didn't turn out on in favor of Democrats on a national level, but locally they were, for the first time in 2016, were able to elect a Puerto Rican to represent them in Congress. Locally at the city and state level, state legislature, they were able to elect Latinos to represent them in Central Florida. In 2018, it was quick and easy to blame the Latino vote for the turnout of the governor's race, but locally, again, they turned out in numbers to get their representatives in office. So yeah, indicators are there.
Who were the three candidates? Excuse me.
Julian went, Elizabeth Warren went, and one other, and I'll have to get that to you afterwards.
Crazy Rich Asians played off of a collection of stereotypes. Is that the way to go for acceptance? Amos and Andy played off stereotypes, and that was wrong.
We stereotype. Just watch. Pardon me. They're my former company, Univision and Telemundo, and look at the prime time and the faces. Although there's a very concerted effort to try to make our physical representations much more diverse and inclusive, but there's still a strong pull towards classically beautiful, blonde, straight hair, fair-skinned representations in terms of actors selected and cast for these roles. So we do it, and shame on us for doing it. So I think it really starts with us. How to
Some of that, hey, I can do it, just don't you do it. There's that, as long as there were Asians in the cast, writing, producing, and it was showing on screens in Singapore and Hong Kong and all that, then it's kind of okay to make those jokes in an almost inside the family spirit. If somebody else made that movie, you might have a problem.
Right, well, look at My Big Fat Greek Wedding, right? I mean, that was written by someone from the community that really wanted to vent about their crazy family. And everyone here, I'm sure, has a crazy family. And you want to write a book, and we can see what happens from there. But I think Crazy Rich Asians was written by the community, ultimately cast representing the community, and it was a big crazy family, right? So I think, as Ray said, it's something that was totally offered up by one who ultimately felt that everyone can share in that commonality. As opposed to Amos and Andy, which I don't think we even need to make a comparison.
Right.
But anyway.
Done with affection
Yes.
and local knowledge. Some of those jokes wouldn't have landed in Crazy Rich Asians unless you knew something about the Chinese community in Singapore and the diaspora nature of Chinatowns in San Francisco and New York. There was a lot of local knowledge quietly built in there that certain discrete audiences would recognize right off, and others would.
Which I would say was still so unique, yet everyone could relate to it to a certain extent.
It's like Coco.
For example, just a real quick example. You come to my house and want to offend my mother, don't eat, right? If she's offering you something, just say yes, right? And a lot of people can relate to that because everyone's got that one matriarch.
Yeah, like Coco. The biggest, it was huge in China because the cultures were relatable in terms of your ancestors, and there's something similar to Day of the Dead in China. So it's all relatable. We all have so many commonalities.
Someone on the panel mentioned the Latino vote, but the Latino vote consists of diverse views ranging from the conservative to the liberal. Are there any unifying political issues for the entire Latino community in the U.S. that should be framed for everyone in the community? It's reasonable.
I find myself as a Latino Democrat, I find myself trying to tell Latino Republicans, that Latinos are also Republican. And I pulling my hair out going, why don't you understand? I disagree with a lot of my sister's a Republican. I don't know why. She still comes to Thanksgiving dinner, and we're all good. But it's that diversity that is in the from political perspectives that is so often ignored because it's just easier from the analysts to say, Democrats are going to vote. Latinos are going to vote Democrat. What's the common issue?
Well, totally
think there
apart
is
from
one.
party, a crummy school
I was about to
in
say
the South
education.
Bronx is very similar to a crummy school in LA Unified or in Houston or in Miami-Dade. Like, that's above and beyond party.
Yeah.
Bad K-12 education is something that's experienced by Latino communities in every corner of the country. That's easy. That's a slam dunk because it shows up as one of the top 3 issues among every group polled, whether you're in Dallas or
Absolutely.
Houston or LA or Manhattan or Florida.
Especially when almost 40% of our entire population is 18 and under. It's going to be a pretty common issue on education. That's what I was going to say. I was just waiting for everybody to finish. And there's a lot of other things too. Care of the elderly.
Well, healthcare is certainly.
Yeah. There's a lot of issues that are going to matter. The environment, hopefully more and more, considering a lot of the immigration issues are based on global warming and climate change in some of these indigenous areas that are putting people out. So there's a whole lot of things that we have.
And regardless of party, there are plenty of socially conservative people, but the fact that large numbers have not been able to prepare adequately for retirement. There's
That's
gonna
why I
be
just
a
said the
lot-
elderly earlier.
A lot of
Yeah.
people turning 60 and 70 in the coming years who simply will not be able to take care of themselves properly.
10,000
in
people
those
turn
years.
retirement age every single day over the next 10 years.
Yeah.
Including me, if I can.
It's the beard. It's the
That's
beard.
right,
No.
Yeah, once it came in gray, I may have to get rid of it. Latino journalists who are on TV should educate their audience that the term illegal aliens is demeaning. They need to mention it while they are on the air. Well, I don't know about while they are on the air, but if you hear it, you probably should drop a line, which is easier to do than it's ever been. It's easier to talk back to your television than it's ever been. If you hear it and it bothers you, don't sit and stew. Let them know, and they actually will change it if enough people do that.
Right.
Things we haven't discussed that you came hoping to say. What do you want to leave these people with as we send them to work?
So much. You talked about Latinx and about labels that we give ourselves. Remember that we're not a monolith, and Latinx is a term that's become popular, I guess, in the last 5 years or so. It started as a way of including everyone, but it's now had more of a gender fluid context recently. But it's, I think, become more the operative word in terms of how we identify the community. I'm at a bit of a loss, but the point is Hispanics and Latinos are not the same. Hispanics is a term that was really coined by the Census Bureau. Correct me if I'm wrong. It was really more of a collective term to identify people of Spanish origin, of Hispanic American origin, of all races and multiple countries. But not all of us identify as Hispanic. Latin America is Latins or Latinos are more a term for people from Latin America as a hemisphere, which includes let's say Haiti and Brazil, for example. But those are not terms that are equally interchangeable, and they're not always adaptable. So in terms of how people want to identify themselves, I think nationality is always the preferred way. Understand that I am Cuban, I am not really Hispanic or Latin American. Those terms don't exist in the Spanish language, by the way. So always be careful how you collectively group us into these monikers that are so easy instead of shorthand for a very, very complex community.
But I wonder, as I hear you say that, I know that a lot of people have that preference. They say, yes, use the national origin as the way you discuss it. And I wonder, because I watch this stuff very closely, whether there's not something new growing here on this continent that is less tied to national origin. And I think about neighborhoods on the northwest side of Chicago where there are large numbers of Mexicans living side by side and amongst and next to Puerto Ricans. And those girls, if you hang out with those girls, they don't call themselves necessarily Mexican or Puerto Rican. They say Latino because it more accurately describes their experience, which is very much separated from both Mexico and Puerto Rico. It has something arguably to do with those places, but in many cases, those girls themselves have never been there.
Right.
That's the point.
Right.
And they know that their life in America is this different, new thing.
Yeah.
When I was younger, which is a long time ago now, a guy like Juan Luis Guerra would never go to Chicago because there are no Dominicans in Chicago. So the thinking was, oh, he plays in these places where there are Dominicans, but he wouldn't go to Chicago because there are no Dominicans there. Well, the last time Juan Luis Guerra played in Chicago at the Rosemont Horizon, which is near O'Hare Airport, this concert, 18,000 people, it sold out in 6 hours. Why? Because Juan Luis Guerra is fabulous, not because he's Dominican. And when I used to get in my rental car at LAX and pull out of the lot and start heading down the freeway, I knew I couldn't hear Puerto Rican music when I turned on the radio before. Now I can because the music's great, not because they think there are lots of Puerto Ricans in LA, which there are not. There's some, 100,000, but so what? My point is that there is a consensus culture growing here that is not tied to San Juan or Mexico City or Buenos Aires or any of those places. It's a thing of here.
Well, and I would also add that I had something else I wanted to wrap up with. I'll wrap up with this. Maybe the next panel we have will be on identity by itself. But I will say, my parents came here from the 60s, so I spent every single summer back in Peru. When I was in Peru, my cousins and relatives called me a gringo. When I was here, they called me Latino or Peruvian or other derogatory terms. Judge Nelson Diaz, my first employer out of law school, general counsel of Department of Housing and Urban Development under Clinton, he wrote a book called Ni de aquí, ni de allá. And it resonated with me because as a first generation, we're stuck. We're stuck. And so when you look at the conversation of who's Latino, even here, when I meet people from Latin America who build their careers in Latin America and then come here, even in casual conversation, they will say, ah, no, pero tú eres gringo. And it's in jest and just, you know, just the friendliness that we have, but it speaks to the effort to exclude and to build smaller, you know, communities among ourselves. And so I totally agree. I often identify myself as a Peruvian American. But when looking at the universal areas that we have to, you know, come together on, it's very hard because we could spend all day dividing ourselves and to no one's benefit, So as we wrap up my comments, I do hope that you will take a look a little further at the American Latino Museum campaign. Today we'll launch One Nation Presente, specifically for that issue, because no matter where you look in the country and where you're actually from. It's one nation, and we are presente. And so I hope you will look at that. Thank you.
For me, it's just to be more inclusive of our community, and that includes non-Latinos and allies, that we need to be very respectful of the fact that it's going to take a concerted effort to move our community forward. And the identity issue is a huge issue for us. You know, we launched an effort called Yo Soy, an identity, at South by Southwest, and it was remarkable when we did a charla and you heard person after person go up with their individual identity as a Latino. And I have kids that have Filipino mother, Latino father that don't speak any Spanish, and one of them is browner than me, the other one is lighter than you. So it all encompasses that as a Latino community, we get richer and richer with our own diversity, whether it's indigenous, whether it's LGBTQ+, whether it's female, whether it's somebody that doesn't speak any Spanish or English, whether it's whatever it is, that we need to be more inclusive as a community to move forward.
Can I just add, the Latino Americans PBS series, thanks to you, and the companion book, is really an excellent reference. You can stream it off of the pbs.org. Really recommend it. I watched it recently again, and really refreshed my knowledge. So thank
And
you.
it's even a book on tape, if you can stand listening to me for 9 hours.
Yeah,
Quite good.
it is very good.
And that was not a solicited
No,
pitch. That was
yeah.
sincere and voluntary. Go ahead.
Thanks. Well, first of all, I want to thank Ray and all of our panelists, but a big thanks to Eileen
Eileen.
Schleff for putting today's panel together. I'm Danny Selnick, and I'm also a member of the Board of Governors here at the Press Club and the leader of the Communicator Committee. We have to keep telling our story. And I say we because I consider myself Hispanic. I lived in Bogota, Colombia for 3 years, and there I was known as Daniel Escobar because nobody could pronounce Selnick. But I'm very attuned to the community and the issues, and we have to keep telling our story. But what we also have to do is to remind journalists, or actually circle back to the reason why we're here, is to have journalists and communicators make sure that they are telling the story, an inclusive story of all multicultural points of view. It has to be part of the narrative. And that's what it's all about. And having heard today's Hispanic leaders, or Latino leaders, what you prefer, is really important. So again, thank you very much for being with us today.
Thank you all. This is great.
Yes, absolutely.
I just wanted to thank Carmen Sluskansky, who has where is he? He heads the events committee, and they were collaborative partners. And that's really important because we're now doing collaborative partnerships among different groups in the press club, which is going to enrich how we present the stories. So thank you all so much. You can stay for coffee and pastries for a little while. Thank you to a wonderful panel.